Hey guys, tonight, we tiptoe into the shadowy corridors of a medieval convent. The wind rustles through ancient stone cloisters, flickering candlelight dances along ivy-covered walls, and somewhere beneath a carved wooden bench, you hear the faint scritch-scratch of tiny claws. A twitch of movement, a blur of fur, and yes, that's a ferret. In a convent, sharing a cell with a nun. It's not a fairy tale or a weird dream, it's just another evening in the Middle Ages. You're standing in woolen slippers that barely muffle your steps on the cold flagstones. The nuns here don't speak after compline, but they don't need to. You catch a smile exchanged between two sisters as a sleek little creature vanishes into the sleeve of one habit and pokes its head out the other side. You rub your eyes. Are you hallucinating? Nope. That's Sister Benedetta, and the blur in her robes is her pet ferret, Simon. Or maybe it's Agnes. They move fast. This isn't some secret fantasy convent where everyone knits and pets animals all day. This is a real place, and you probably wouldn't survive here. The damp alone would flatten you in the food. Let's just say oat porridge for every meal isn't as rustic chic as Instagram makes it look. Still, somehow, despite the fasting, the silence, and the relentless work, these nuns found comfort in a whiskered, wiggly, chaos-loving companion that probably chewed on their sandals while they prayed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling cozy already, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing just how global our sleepy little monastery really is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the firelit hall, where a few nuns huddle together in the evening hours, whispering over mending work. Someone hums a Gregorian chant under her breath. Another carefully sews a rip in her habit. You spot something fuzzy curled at her feet, nose twitching gently in sleep. This was common. Well, commonish. Historians still argue whether keeping ferrets inside the convent was officially sanctioned, or more of a tolerated rebellion. But across scattered monastic records often buried in the margins of bigger stories, there are glimpses of nuns keeping these lively little animals, not just for work, but for companionship. In the dark, drafty reality of medieval cloister, life joy was scarce. Days were ruled by bells and prayer, and the rule of Saint Benedict loomed large: discipline, silence, poverty, obedience. But even inside those rigid expectations, nuns were human. And humans, especially humans, surrounded by rats and musty parchment, sometimes need a furry friend. Not every convent allowed pets, of course. But ferrets were sly little loopholes. Officially, they were there to catch mice. Unofficially, they were tucked into warm robes on cold nights, shared morsels of cheese, and occasionally wore tiny woven collars with little silver bells. Because if you're going to risk a scolding from the abbess, it might as well be for something adorable. You hear a soft shuffle behind a wooden door and peek in. A novice is asleep at her desk, drooling slightly on a half-finished, illuminated capital. On the windowsill, a pale cream ferret suns itself, and the weak winter light tail twitching like a sleepy question mark. It yawns. You yawn too. It's hard not to envy the calm here, even with the cold and the rules. There's something warm beneath the wool layers, something about the quiet routines and the unspoken affection between woman and mustelid. A secret life humming gently under the stern gaze of saints painted on the walls. The ferrets, of course, don't care about decorum. They leap from bench to bench, stealing scraps of bread and occasionally the ink quills. One was caught dragging an entire cassock across the dormitory once, and no one has fully forgiven it. Still, the nuns tolerate the chaos. some even relish it. Whiskers twitching, a young ferret climbs into a basket of laundry, tunneling deep into the linen folds. A nun sighs, but lets it be. You watch her fingers, cracked from scrubbing floors, pause for a moment to stroke the ferret's head. Its eyes close. For a second, everything is still. Then someone sneezes in the corridor, likely from the hay bedding, and the ferret bolts, all teeth and fur and purpose. Laughter echoes softly down the hallway. A rule has been broken. Somewhere a novice is writing a tiny apology in Latin. So yes, ferrets lived among the Holy Sisters, not because they were spiritual guides or ecclesiastical mascots, but because they were warm, soft, and a little wild. They were reminders that even inside walls built for silence and sacrifice, life still twitches and scampers and chews on your only pair of socks. And you're still standing there in the twilight, nose cold, heart warm, wondering if any of these creatures knew they'd end up in an obscure bedtime history tale centuries later. Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into the shadowy corridors of a medieval convent. The wind rustles through ancient stone cloisters, flickering candlelight dances along ivy-covered walls, and somewhere beneath a carved wooden bench, you hear the faint scritch-scratch of tiny claws. A twitch of movement, a blur of fur, and yes, that's a ferret. In a convent, sharing a cell with a nun. It's not a fairy tale or a weird dream. It's just another evening in the Middle Ages. And you're still standing there in the twilight, nose cold, heart warm, wondering if any of these creatures knew they'd end up in an obscure bedtime history tale centuries later. You've barely settled into the rhythm of the convent before you notice something strange in the kitchen. Not the bubbling of soup pots or the grinding of barley flour that's normal. No, it's the alert posture of the kitchen nuns. Their heads snap toward every squeak or rustle. Eyes dart. They're waiting. And then it happens, a skitter across the stone floor, a tiny brown blur, and a ferret launches itself after it faster than sin on a Sunday. Welcome to the great rodent crisis of cloister life. You may not have considered this, but medieval monasteries were like all-you-can-eat buffets for rodents. Grains stored in cool, dark cellars, stacks of cheese aging in smoky rafters, root vegetables lined up like sitting ducks. It was mouse paradise. Except mice don't pay rent, and they definitely don't respect the sanctity of your psalms. The problem wasn't just the food. Rats and mice had a taste for wax linen, even inked vellum. One bold mouse reportedly chewed through an entire illuminated page of Matthew's Gospel before anyone noticed, earning it an unflattering nickname from the scribe, the blasphemous devourer. That one didn't live long. The nuns tried everything. Wooden traps, homemade poisons, prayers to Saint Gertrude of Nivelles. Yes, she's the patron saint of rodent control, and one very determined cat named Benedicta, who retired early after a mouse bit her tail and she decided holiness wasn't worth it. Then someone, perhaps a clever nun with Roman ancestry, or just a desperate kitchen assistant, remembered the ferret. Small, fast, wriggly, and with a metabolism powered entirely by chaos, the ferret had been used in rural homes and noble estates to keep rodent populations down. Why not here, historians still argue whether the ferrets arrived through formal invitation or snuck in under robes and baskets smuggled by sisters from nearby villages. But once they were in, they proved their worth. You picture it now, Sister Matilda's sleeves rolled up cheering as her ferret Margot cornered 3 field mice in the grain cellar like a furry exorcist. At first, the ferrets were treated strictly as working animals. No names, no cuddles, just sharp teeth and swift paws. But you know how that goes. First they catch a mouse, then they curl up in your lap while you mend your sandals. Then you're hand-feeding them bits of cheese and whispering bedtime prayers into their ears. By the time the abbess noticed, it was too late. The rodents were fewer, the sisters were happier, and the ferrets, they had moved in. The convent didn't need to justify their presence. Pest control was holy work. Even the rule of Saint Benedict had wiggle room for practicality. The Lord may provide, but he didn't personally fight off rats in the barley bins. Of course there were issues. Ferrets are notoriously stubborn. Some would catch a mouse only to lose interest halfway and fall asleep on top of it. Others developed an appetite for dried fruit or tried to stash eggs in their bedding. One bold soul chewed through a novice's sandal and was found sleeping inside it, smug and purring. Despite their quirks, the ferrets won their place in cloister life. Not everyone was thrilled. Some of the older sisters grumbled that the noise disrupted their devotions. One even claimed the ferret had the eyes of a sinner. But most agreed if it meant fewer gnawed scrolls and less midnight scuttling in the rafters, it was a price worth paying. There were even, believe it or not, reports of convents lending their ferrets to neighboring priories or towns during particularly bad infestations. Picture it, a traveling nun cloak, billowing ferret on her shoulder, like a furry apostle arriving to cleanse your granary. Saints bless her. You crouch near the stone pantry, now watching a pair of ferrets stalk something invisible with intense dedication. Their bodies curve like ribbons, their noses twitch with purpose. One trips over a broken tile but recovers with exaggerated dignity. The other snorts like a small sneeze and launches itself behind a barrel. And just like that, you understand. They're tiny, chaotic blessings in a world otherwise ruled by silence and duty. They brought laughter to the kitchen, kept food stores safe, and gave the sisters a reason to smile between psalm verses. Of course, the bishop wouldn't approve of cuddles. But let's be honest, bishops didn't clean the cellars. You step into the scriptorium just in time to hear a nun mutter barely above a whisper, "Oh no, not again." She clutches her stylus like a weapon as her eyes dart across the shadowed floorboards. In a place devoted to silence, the tiniest sounds seem enormous. The faint crinkle of parchment, the soft plunk of dripping wax, and yep, there it is again. A high-pitched squeal and a sudden rustle in the straw behind the bench. The silence here isn't just ritual, it's law. These nuns have taken a vow. They cannot cry out, not even when a mouse runs across their bare foot or chews a corner of their Psalm 91, which, in case you're wondering, is the one about being safe from pestilence. Irony, thy name is Ratatouille. So they needed a workaround. Enter the ferret. See, when you can't yell at a mouse, you send in something that can. Imagine the quiet stillness of early morning prayers, the sun just barely filtering through stained glass panes, when suddenly scuffle, scritch, squeak, a mouse darts across the tile. Sister Agnes closes her eyes. She cannot speak. But at her side, her ferret named Judith the Mouse Slayer springs into action. Problem solved, vows intact. Historians still argue whether the church ever officially condoned the use of ferrets in cloistered spaces, but most agree it was one of those don't ask, don't tell situations. As long as no one screamed and the choir book stayed unnibbled, Rome looked the other way. You trail one nun now, her wooden shoes tapping softly on the stone floor. She gestures toward a corner, not speaking, just pointing. Her ferret bounds over and disappears behind a pile of burlap sacks. Seconds later, a faint eep, then silence. The nun nods with satisfaction and returns to her work. It's almost ballet, this coordination between silent women and their noisy companions. They become a team. A nun might never utter a word in daylight, but her ferret shouts plenty on her behalf. Squeaks, chittering, even angry growls. It's like a one mustelid protest against vermin and disorder. The irony, of course, is delicious. The very animals that brought chaos also enforced discipline. Ferrets were the wild card in a deck otherwise stacked with order, and while their paws never touched a psalter, their impact is literally etched into history. One manuscript from a Yorkshire convent has margins pocked with tiny claw marks. Whether they were chasing mice or just staging a paper rebellion, no one knows. But the nuns kept the pages anyway. It's here in this odd choreography of restraint and feral freedom that you sense something deeper. These weren't just animals, they were proxies. Tiny avatars of action in a world where women couldn't shout, couldn't strike, couldn't curse when their cheese disappeared or their tunics were chewed. But their ferrets could, and did, loudly. Not all sisters were thrilled with the arrangement, mind you. Sister Clarissa, known for her fastidious calligraphy, once tried to ban ferrets from the scriptorium after one relieved itself on the Gospel of Luke. There was a brief, silent standoff. The ferret won. In some convents, a new novice might be paired with a ferret as part of her chores, feeding, cleaning, and patrolling the dormitory for signs of mice. The pairing was practical, yes, but also strangely bonding. One letter from a nun in Mainz describes her ferret as her comfort and quiet fury. We don't know the ferret's name, but honestly, that's probably because it changed weekly, depending on its mood. You lean against the cool stone, now watching as another ferret zips between two pews. A novice tries to catch it, but it zigzags with glee tongue flicking out like a giggle. The nun can't speak, but she grins wide and wordless. This strange little creature, neither tame nor wild, had carved out a space in holy life not in sermons or stained glass, but in the quiet corners of the day, in the break between prayers, in the silent laugh shared over an overturned inkpot. They filled a gap that the rules didn't cover: emotion companionship, the kind of small rebellion that never makes it into church records, but always finds a place in the heart. And so you wander further, beginning to realize that silence in this place isn't always stillness. Sometimes it sounds like tiny feet skittering across the cloister, like breathless giggles stifled behind sleeves, like one very determined ferret gnawing through the corner of a cheese wheel. You step through a narrow archway into what passes for the convent's infirmary, a chilly, slightly mildew-scented room filled with herbal fumes, woolen blankets, and the quiet rustle of parchment and prayer. A nun sits beside a straw mattress, grinding dried lavender and yarrow into a mortar, while another dabs honey onto a bruised ankle. All very soothing, until a ferret bounds up onto the foot of the bed and immediately starts trying to eat the linen bandage. Yes, even here in the holiest and most delicate of spaces, the ferrets come. You're starting to notice a pattern. These animals weren't just tolerated, they were everywhere, even in places where they had no business being, like say next to a nun recovering from a stubborn lung ailment, whose cough was reportedly greatly soothed by the presence of a small, wiggly companion who slept curled around her wrist. She named him Brother Crispin. Historians still debate whether this qualifies as early animal-assisted therapy or just medieval people being weird and lonely. But there's no question ferrets found their way into the sick rooms and warm corners of convents, not only as pest controllers, but as oddly comforting presences. Their heat, their curiosity, even their rhythmic breathing as they dozed, brought a peculiar kind of peace to women otherwise starved of physical contact. Remember, these were places of renunciation. No hugs, no romantic love, no family to lean on. For many nuns, especially the ones given to the convent by family at a young age, the only warm body they might cuddle with after compline was, well, a ferret. And as odd as it sounds, ferrets fit the role. They're quiet, they like to burrow, they form attachments, and they don't ask questions when you whisper secrets into their fur. You picture it now, Sister Blanche, racked with fever, clutching a hot brick in one hand and her sleepy ferret in the other. The sisters prayed, but the ferret stayed, and somehow she pulled through. The convent herbalist, a woman with permanent mint under her nails and an eyebrow that says, "Don't test me," even made ferret-specific salves. Not for humans to use on ferrets, but for the ferrets themselves. Because naturally, when your tiny friend spends all day crawling through wood piles and sprinting after mice, they come home with scratches. You'd be amazed what a little beeswax and thyme can do for a ferret's paws. There's even an obscure monastic record from a French priory that lists a ferret as a resident patient after it injured itself leaping off a bench to chase a beetle. The record dryly notes that sisterly affection delayed Vespers for this cause. Translation: the whole community skipped evening prayers because tiny Mouse Lord sprained his leg. Priorities. And if you're wondering whether all this affection was universally accepted, no, not exactly. One abbot visiting from a neighboring monastery was so scandalized by the sight of a ferret curled beside a sleeping nun that he wrote a strongly worded letter to Rome. Rome notably never answered. Maybe even they realized in a world where mortality lurked in every chill and shadow, a little fuzzy companionship wasn't the worst sin on record. Theologically, it raised questions. Was it proper for a woman pledged to divine chastity to form such deep attachments to animals? Could affection, even innocent whisker-related affection, distract from devotion? Historians still argue whether these bonds were emotional indulgences or spiritual metaphors. Some believed the nuns were practicing stewardship, compassion, and humility through care of the ferrets. Others thought it was just a lot of cuddling that made no sense to crusty male theologians. You settle onto a stool beside a low bed, where another nun lies, resting her face pale, her breath shallow. At her feet, a sleek ferret is curled into the curve of her knee, like it's guarding her dreams. You don't move. You barely breathe. The only sounds are the scratch of quill on parchment and the soft, rhythmic sighs of two bodies, one human one not resting side by side. It's a strange image, isn't it? So tender and so outside what we picture when we imagine medieval religion. But maybe that's the point. Holiness for these women wasn't about perfection, it was about endurance. About waking up every day in a cold stone building eating flavorless broth and still managing to love something enough to knit it a tiny woolen blanket. Yes, that happened. More than once. And if you're wondering whether these ferrets lived long lives in the cloister, well, sometimes they did. But more often their lives were short and bittersweet. There are elegies written in the margins of books, little notes in Latin mourning my most faithful mouse slayer now returned to the dust. There were tiny burial spots under rose bushes, sometimes even small wooden crosses. So as you linger in this infirmary, you begin to understand these nuns weren't just living with animals. They were forming bonds in a place where affection was rationed. And when death came, as it so often did, it wasn't just the sisters who were grieved. The ferrets, too, had earned their place in the convent's rhythm of life and loss. You wander out to the cloister garden expecting silence, the kind filled with bees and breeze and a nun humming something Gregorian under her breath. And mostly that's what you find. A low stone wall ringed with herbs, the air sweet with rosemary and tansy, a few sisters tending the beds with care as delicate as any prayer. But wait, just past the lavender movement. A blur, a rustle, a triumphant squeak. And then a ferret bursts from the underbrush tail, high trailing what looks like half a sock in its teeth. This, you realize, is not a quiet place at all. Welcome to recess for rodent hunters, better known as the ferret hour. Even in these highly disciplined environments, convents understood the need for balance. Nuns weren't machines. Their days were structured, yes, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, then chores, study, and silence. But between the lines, there were soft spaces, and in those ferrets flourished. These animals didn't just work, they played, and sometimes so did the sisters. Historians still argue whether convent rules formally allowed pets during recreation periods, or whether this was just a case of, we're not telling the abbess. But we know that gardens became arenas of gentle mischief. Picture it, a dozen habits flapping as young novices dash after a ferret who's stolen a rosary. Laughter muffled behind sleeves, a chase around the grapevines that ends with someone collapsing breathless into a patch of time. There's something strangely wholesome about it. In a world full of fleas, famine, and a high likelihood of dying from drinking water, these small moments of joy became essential, and ferrets, ever the entertainers, were central to them. Of course, not all the play was voluntary. Some ferrets were escape artists. One abbess reportedly spent an entire afternoon retrieving a particularly rowdy specimen from the rafters of the chapel, where it had wedged itself upside down and refused to come out until bribed with cheese. The event was recorded wryly in the convent annals. The creature resisted exorcism, but relented for dairy. Some convents even developed what could only be described as games. One involved releasing a ferret into a small wooden maze built, mind you, by the nuns themselves from broken fence slats, and betting silently, of course, on which path it would take. Another popular pastime was the sock chase, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. Toss a bit of cloth, see who retrieves it faster, the nun or the ferret. It wasn't always so lighthearted. There were rules. Sister Imelda once tried to bring her ferret to choir practice as an emotional support animal and was firmly, if silently, redirected. Another novice faced penance after her ferret stole communion wafers, though to be fair, the creature probably thought they were crackers. But over time, these little moments wove themselves into convent life. You can still find marginalia in prayer books, tiny doodles of ferrets chasing mice curling in baskets, or in one cheeky instance, dressed in a nun's wimple. Some scholars believe these drawings were acts of affection. Others say they were coded complaints. Honestly, probably both. You crouch beside a row of cabbages, now watching a trio of sisters construct what looks like an obstacle course from overturned buckets. A ferret waits at the starting line, eyes narrowed in feral anticipation. One nun waves a beetroot like a starter flag, and they're off. And maybe that's what made ferrets so beloved, not just their utility, not just their warmth, but the way they injected surprise into a life that was otherwise predictably holy. They were the divine interruption, the blessed chaos, the reminder that even among psalms and rules, there was still space for joy. The church, you suspect, never quite knew what to make of it. One bishop wrote of concerning reports of unorthodox animal engagements in the cloister. Another praised the industrious and agile weasel beast given by Providence to protect the holy stores. The opinions varied, but the ferrets stayed, and so did the laughter. You lean back against the wall, watching a nun attempt to wrestle her veil away from a particularly ambitious ferret. She wins barely. The ferret pouts, then promptly leaps into a watering can and vanishes. You smile, because in this place of vows and visions, these fuzzy anarchists reminded everyone that holiness wasn't always serious. Sometimes it looked like a ferret in a shoe. The kitchen smells like smoke yeast and onions gone slightly too soft. You step carefully over a bucket of turnips and into a space that is frankly too small for the number of humans and animals coexisting inside it. The cook is fanning a fire with one hand and shooing away a ferret with the other, muttering something unholy in Latin under her breath. though you suspect the ferret understands none of it and would not care even if it did. Welcome to the hidden battlefield of every convent, the pantry. Food preservation in medieval Europe was already a nightmare. You had no refrigeration, unpredictable seasons, and vermin with the appetite of cursed royalty. In convents, the situation was worse. Nuns were tasked with storing grain, cheese, dried fish, salted pork on feast days, and dozens of other storable but vulnerable supplies in cellars and sheds that attracted mice and rats like sinners to temptation. Enter the ferret cloister cuisine's most chaotic guardian. Ferrets didn't just chase mice, they hunted. Ruthlessly. Their lithe bodies could squeeze behind barrels under shelves and into the tiny holes rodents used to sneak into the wheat sacks. Historians still argue whether convents actively bred ferrets for kitchen work, or whether they simply acquired them when the rodent situation got dire enough to warrant divine intervention with fur. Either way, once a ferret had proven its worth by clearing a granary or single-handedly liberating the dried apricot jar from infestation, it was there to stay. You watch now as a small cinnamon-colored ferret patrols the base of a cupboard with military precision. Its nose twitches, its tail flicks. Somewhere deep in the shadows, something squeaks its final squeak. The nun at the bread table doesn't even flinch. She drops a crust down by her feet as a silent thank you. But these holy hunters were not without their flaws. For one thing, they had zero respect for boundaries. Food, once unguarded, was fair game not just from pests, but from the very animals meant to protect it. Many a nun has turned her back for 5 seconds, only to discover her breakfast eggs vanished into the folds of a cheeky ferret's hiding place. They especially liked butter. Still do. It's a mystery. Maybe it's a sin. There's a legendary tale from a convent in southern Germany of a ferret who developed such a taste for honey that the sisters began leaving out sacrificial spoonfuls each morning to prevent raids on their actual store jars. They called him Brother Beesbane. He once got his head stuck in a jug and had to be blessed out with a psalm and a stick. Some of these incidents made their way into the convent ledgers, not as formal records, but as sly complaints in the margins. One reads simply, "Lost 3 oatcakes to the whiskered one." Again. Lord grant me patience. But of course, affection persisted. There's something oddly intimate about sharing food, even stolen food, with a creature. When you break a biscuit in half and hand it to your ferret, okay, yes, technically, he already stole half. You're forming a bond that goes beyond utility. You're building trust in the quiet spaces between the bell tolls. Nuns began to bake extra bits on purpose, crusty scraps. Too tough for humans, perfect for ferret teeth. They called it Pax Fair Peace Food. Not an official liturgical term, but a little convent slang that captured the spirit of coexistence. And in return, loyalty. Some ferrets became protective of their kitchens. One nun's diary describes a ferret that would stand guard by the cream jug and hiss at anyone who approached, even the abbess. No one dared remove it. The cream simply had to be poured somewhere else. It's not hard to see why these animals carved out such enduring space in a setting that prized simplicity and self-restraint. Ferrets were neither simple nor restrained, but they were clever, responsive, and strangely enough, community-oriented in their own chaotic way. You shift toward the back of the kitchen now, where the cold cellar hums with the faint scent of root vegetables. A sister carefully unlatches the door, lets her ferret slip in ahead of her, and waits. Moments later, skitter, thump, silence. She enters, nods approvingly, and closes the door behind her. Routine, ritual, rodent control. There's something almost spiritual in it, the daily repetition of small tasks, aided by small creatures, all working together to keep hunger and disorder at bay. It might not look like prayer, but it feels like purpose. So yes, the kitchen ferrets were occasionally thieving, frequently disobedient, and once started a fire by knocking over a lantern, but they also kept the community alive. Not just through pest control, but by offering a little mischief, a little warmth, a little nudge toward joy in a space that too often reeked of boiled cabbage. By now you're starting to wonder, with all this tail-wagging chaos, did nobody in the convent try to stop it? Surely someone objected to these furry interlopers chewing on hymnals, nesting in shoeboxes, and stealing radishes from the abbess's personal stash. Oh, someone did. Several someones, in fact. Welcome to the Great Ferret Pushback, or as it might be better titled, the long, slow eye roll of authority. Inside the chapter house, you settle into a wooden bench beside a large, somber ledger. It's filled with neat Latin entries, mostly boring penances, assigned donations, perceived wheat prices fluctuating. But nestled between the lines, a complaint. Item, let it be known that Sister Agnes allows the weasel beast into the chapel, even upon the altar steps, where it did bite the hem of the lector's robe and cause a disturbance of the psalms. It's not signed, but you can feel the disapproval radiating off the ink. Ferrets, it turns out, were not universally beloved. Certain nuns, often the older ones or those more by the book, saw them as distractions, or worse, temptations. Affection, after all, could be a slippery slope. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't specifically mention ferrets, but it did emphasize moderation, focus, and above all, detachment from worldly pleasures. Historians still argue whether the criticism was about hygiene theology, or just the deeply annoying sound of tiny claws clicking down a cloister hallway in the middle of silent prayer. Likely, it was all of the above. One particularly stern abbess, known only as Mother C, in surviving records, famously declared the ferrets agents of idle fondness and issued a convent-wide edict: no ferrets in the dormitories, no ferrets in the chapel, and most tragically, no ferrets at mealtimes. They were to remain outside or in the granary only. You can imagine the response. Eye twitches, hidden giggles. One rebellious novice reportedly tried to disguise her ferret in a knitted bonnet and carry it in under her sleeve as a small, hairy relic. She got caught, but the legend endured. Resistance to ferrets came in waves, often tied to the mood of church leadership. During periods of reform, especially those emphasizing stricter asceticism, some convents were ordered to ban all animals unless explicitly used for labor. This led to several tragic partings, some of which are recorded in prayer book margins with such heartbreak that they rival the poetry of saints. One nun wrote, "I have sent my companion to the fields. May the angels keep him warm as I no longer may." But not all orders complied. Some quietly reclassified their ferrets as pest control aids. Others argued the animals were gifts of God's providence. A particularly clever abbess went so far as to name her ferret Discipline, so that when she said she was spending more time with discipline, no one could argue. You've got to respect the hustle. Even among the disapprovers, though there were shades of tolerance. While some abbots scolded, others shrugged. One famously visited a convent and was greeted at the door by a ferret wearing a scrap of linen as a sort of bib. He laughed so hard, he gave the convent an extra stipend for animal feed. More serious attempts at banning usually faltered when faced with practical reality. Ferrets kept the rats away. They brought joy, and their sudden absence often led to a spike in spoiled grain, chewed sandals, and low morale. It's hard to preach obedience when everyone's oatmeal tastes like mouse. And so the pushback faded into a kind of weary coexistence. The rules were written. The ferrets ignored them. The abbess frowned. The novices giggled. Life, as always, found a way. You walk now through a hallway lined with stone, a draft slipping down its length like a quiet sigh. From a half-open doorway comes a familiar sound, scuffle, scratch, sneeze. You peer in. A nun kneels beside a wicker basket scolding a ferret who has dragged her knitting across the floor and tangled it into something resembling a divine punishment. She shakes her head, but does not remove the ferret. Instead, she picks it up, kisses its nose, and places it gently on a windowsill. The fight against ferrets, it seems, was never won. But maybe that's because it wasn't supposed to be. You make your way into the scriptorium, a hushed, golden-lit room where the air smells of parchment beeswax and ink ground with wine vinegar. Sunlight streams through leaded windows, catching dust motes mid-drift. Around you, nuns stoop over desks, with the patience of saints copying out psalms with goose-feather quills and monkish determination. It is, you think, the very picture of serene, holy labor until a ferret skitters across the floor with a stolen ink pot in its mouth. Welcome to the scribal crisis, or how one small animal with too much energy became both muse and menace in the literary heart of a convent. Ferrets had a complicated relationship with books. On one hand, they loved them, specifically the parchment, which they found perfect for sleeping on, chewing, or occasionally dragging away into secret lairs behind wood paneling. On the other hand, scribes grew oddly fond of the chaos they brought. There's a delightful historical quirk here, marginalia. Those bizarre, delightful, and often inexplicable illustrations drawn in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Cats with fish heads, rabbits jousting, nuns riding snails, and sometimes ferrets. Historians still argue whether the ferret doodles were affectionate portraits of pets, satire aimed at unruly behavior in the convent, or even cryptic personal signatures. But they're there. Tiny, long-bodied figures chasing mice, stealing loaves, or curled up under scripture like furry bookmarks. Some even wear tiny hoods or hold scrolls, proof maybe that their presence wasn't just tolerated, but cherished. One manuscript from a Bavarian convent contains a full-page illumination of Saint Jerome and his lion. But just behind the lion in the corner is a smug-looking ferret eating a biscuit. Unnamed, unexplained, irresistible. You settle beside a nun bent over her work, and you notice a bit of string tied to her sleeve. One end is attached to her quill, the other to a ferret curled around her elbow. Insurance, apparently. If the ferret bolts, so does the pen. Scriptoriums were vulnerable to more than just theft. Parchment was expensive, ink was finicky, and candlelight made the eyes burn. A moment of distraction could ruin a page of slow, back-breaking work. So, of course, ferrets adored them. They'd leap into laps, knock over ink, chase the reflection of sunlight off polished chalice lids. And yet no one truly banned them. Because they brought something else with them, too warmth. In cold convents with no heating but bodies and faith, having a sleepy ferret tucked in your habit while copying the Book of Hours could be the difference between numb fingers and nimble ones. More than once, a nun would place her ferret on her lap just to act as a furry little heating pad. There are reports, some playful, some serious, of scribes blaming their errors on ferret mischief. One line reads, "This letter I did forget, for the animal did sneeze upon my thumb." Another more stoic entry states, "Ink spilt weasel at fault," redeemed with fasting. And then there's the infamous case of the Psalter page swap. According to a convent chronicle, two nuns, Sister Digna and Sister Elfrida, left their nearly completed psalters side by side on a table. During evening prayer, one of their ferrets made off with a sheaf of pages from each and hid them under a pew. The next morning, in a rush to finish, the nuns accidentally bound the wrong folios into each other's books. Neither noticed for weeks, and when they did, the scribal mistake was so beautiful, no one had the heart to fix it. The psalters remain misbound to this day. In the margin of the swapped pages, a drawing of a ferret winking. Not all stories are charming. One small disaster involved a ferret chewing through a leather binding, causing an entire gospel to collapse mid-shelving. The resulting noise startled a visiting priest so badly he dropped a chalice. The incident was never fully explained to the bishop. Still, you get the sense that ferrets made the scriptorium feel less lonely. Copying texts was sacred work, but also deeply isolating. Long hours hunched over repeating words, ink smudging the temptation to drift. But with a ferret wrapped around your ankle or peeking from under your sleeve, the work had rhythm, life. Even mischief had its place. You glance down at a nearby writing desk. In the corner, barely visible, someone has carved a tiny phrase, "He sleeps, I write." It's hard not to smile. Because in this quiet room of endless repetition of holy words copied until they blur, a small creature curled beside you is more than just company. It's a kind of prayer all its own. You step out into the herb garden, where everything is damp with dew and humming with the quiet drone of bees. Lavender sage and feverfew press against your legs as you walk the narrow stone paths, each plant carefully cultivated by the same hands that write psalms in men's sandals. The morning light hasn't fully broken yet. It slides in soft and golden over the convent wall, and beside a cluster of rosemary, a ferret is doing somersaults in the dirt. This section of convent life was perhaps the most peaceful tending the earth. Gardening was sacred labor. Nuns didn't just grow herbs for seasoning and medicine. They grew symbols of divine care. Mint for clarity, marigold for comfort, rue for repentance, and ferrets. Well, they weren't so much cultivated as tolerated. Encouraged even when they stuck to chasing beetles or scaring away the voles that dug into carrot beds. Less so when they stole the parsley. Still, every good convent garden had a beast path, an unofficial trail where ferrets, cats, and the occasional visiting hedgehog wandered through the greenery like little furry pilgrims. Some gardens even had low stone walls with built-in holes, not for drainage, but as secret passageways for the four-legged residents. Historians still argue whether these holes were deliberate architectural features or just happy accidents turned into custom. Either way, ferrets made use of them with the kind of confidence usually reserved for bishops. You kneel beside a patch of chamomile and catch a glimpse of two sisters gently brushing burrs from the fur of a sleepy ferret. One of them hums a low tune with no words. It's not a hymn, not exactly, but the rhythm is soothing. That's the thing about garden time, it blurred the lines between work and meditation. There are stories of nuns who trained their ferrets to help with small tasks in the garden. One known locally as Saint Weasel would carry twine from one row of peas to the next, encouraged by bits of boiled egg and soft praise. Another was trained, though this is debated, to gently herd snails away from the lettuce beds. Whether this is true or simply convent folklore passed around for laughs during long winters, you'll never know. But you like the idea of it, a ferret with a mission. And while not all ferrets were so productive, they were often present during the convent's quieter restorative moments. They'd nestle in cloaks left on garden benches, curl up in sun-warmed clay pots, or sit perfectly still while the sisters recited midday prayers among the thyme and chives. The garden, in fact, was one of the few places where ferrets were universally accepted, even by the stricter members of the order. Something about the open air, the natural setting, made their presence feel less like disruption and more like context. God made animals, after all. And if some of them were long, squirmy, and prone to stealing radishes, well, that was just part of the world's humor. A chronicle from a French convent describes the moment a ferret stole a novice's rosary mid-prayer. Instead of rebuking the girl for losing focus, the abbess reportedly chuckled and said, "God teaches patience through small paws." That line was later embroidered onto a kneeling cushion. It's still preserved in a museum somewhere. You pass a small fountain in the center of the garden. A ferret sits on the rim tail dangling, watching a droplet form and fall again and again from the lion head spout. Behind you, a sister begins her task of snipping calendula blossoms into a basket, occasionally tossing one to the ferret, who baps it with a lazy paw. There's a rhythm to this place, a balance. The same ferret that steals your bread in the morning might sit with you in the garden by noon and nap beside your feet while you mutter the Psalms. They weren't pets exactly, and they certainly weren't property, but they belonged here, just like you. The garden teaches you that gently, not through sermons or stern proverbs, but through the quiet trust of small creatures who choose to stay nearby, who seek your shade, who don't flee when you kneel beside them. And that's the heart of it, really. The nuns didn't love ferrets because they were useful, though they were, or amusing, though endlessly, or warm in winter, debatably. They loved them because ferrets chose to share space. They wandered into the convent one day, probably chasing mice, and decided to stay. And the nuns, who had given up most worldly things, couldn't help but feel honored by the company. You move now toward a stone bench under an old fig tree. The bell tolls in the distance, calling for none a middle-of-the-day pause for reflection and prayer. But here in the garden, the pause has already begun. A ferret curls beside your ankle, sighs and sleeps. There's a damp smell of old stone and candle smoke as you descend into the underbelly of the convent, the cellar and the storerooms, the quiet and forgotten places where provisions are tucked away like secrets. It's cool here, and a little darker than you'd like. But down one narrow corridor, you hear something unmistakable, the sound of paws scampering across a barrel lid. You've just entered the ferret underground. While gardens and scriptoriums were the public stage for ferret life, the cellars belonged to them outright. These spaces used for storing salted fish, pickled onions, and the less glamorous parts of medieval convent survival became impromptu playgrounds and ferret kingdoms, and not without reason. These were also the domains of rats, mice, and the occasional wayward beetle colony. Most convents struggled with food security, and spoilage from vermin was a daily concern. So when ferrets decided to patrol the underworld like little four-legged knights, nobody stopped them. In fact, some convents actively encouraged it. There's a dusty ledger from a 13th century Belgian priory, where an abbess includes in the budget 2 measures barley, 1 measure vinegar, 1 small fish for feeding of the long-tailed rat hunter. No name, no breed, just rat hunter. You know who it is. Historians still argue whether these entries referred to domesticated polecats, ferret cousins, working ferrets brought in from local farmers, or actual convent-raised pets doing double duty. Likely it was a rotating cast of characters. But once a ferret arrived, they tended not to leave. The cellars, though, weren't just for work. They were where mischief bloomed unchecked. You can imagine a young novice sneaking down with a crust of bread in her sleeve looking for her favorite fuzzy companion. She calls in a whisper, Pia, and hears the shuffle of claws, the flick of a nose from behind a cask of elderberry wine. There are stories, half joke, half warning, of ferrets hiding things. Not just food scraps, but ribbon chalk, even a silver spoon gone missing for years before being discovered in a nest of dried hops. One particularly chaotic creature earned the name Saint Thief and was even painted in a small illuminated border of the convent's kitchen inventory record tongue sticking out in triumph. What's more, The cellar was the perfect temperature for baby ferrets. Warm enough to survive the chill, dark enough for mothers to rest, quiet enough not to disturb the upstairs rituals. Which meant that over time, some ferrets began to breed down here, turning the convent basement into a full-blown fuzzy nursery. One nun wrote in the margin of her rulebook 7 kits born beneath the vinegar barrels, "The mother doth sleep through lauds. I envy her." But cellar ferret life wasn't entirely peaceful. Ferrets, like people, had squabbles. A novice once tried to keep 3 males together in a bucket-turned nest. The results involved a fair amount of screeching, one ruined habit, and several hours of damage control. From then on, ferrets were kept with a better understanding of their moods and their teeth. Despite this, many nuns claimed their strongest bonds with animals were formed down here, where no one watched. In the quiet hush of the storeroom, with only the creak of wooden shelves and the far-off echo of vespers, it was easier to speak aloud, to pet a ferret and tell it your worries, to ask it questions you wouldn't dare ask the abbess. One record found scribbled on the inside of a dried egg ledger reads, "I told her I might not belong here." She sniffed my thumb and left. I take this as agreement. There's a strange kind of companionship that forms in secret between quiet creatures and those who feel unseen. You can picture the novice sitting with her back to a cold barrel, whispering doubts into the fur of a dozing ferret who understands exactly none of it, and also maybe all of it. Ferrets didn't preach. They didn't gossip. They didn't tell you to smile more or fold your veil properly. They just sat. They blinked at you. They chewed on your sleeve, and sometimes they bit your finger. But they stayed. And when the bell called again, pulling everyone back up into the world of rules chants and fasting, it was always a little harder to leave the cellar behind. You glance over your shoulder as you climb the stairs. From a dark corner behind a barrel, 2 glowing eyes meet yours. There's a pause, a twitch, and then the creature vanishes into shadow. Down there, the ferret still reigns. The refectory smells faintly of stale bread, damp wool, and 1,000 whispered prayers. You file in behind the others, hands folded, trying not to step on the hem of your habit. It's mealtime in the convent, a daily ritual that blends sacred silence with very practical logistics. Platters of lentils, root vegetables, and whatever cheese survived the week are already being passed down the table. You take your seat nod and begin spooning your gruel like a proper medieval ascetic. Then a ferret climbs onto the bench beside you and tries to steal your turnip. Welcome to the great dining truce. If the garden was the ferret playground and the cellar their fortress, then the refectory was the arena for daily diplomacy. Not every nun loved this arrangement. In theory, meals were taken in silence while a designated reader recited scripture or saintly anecdotes from a wooden lectern. In practice, it was a hushed battlefield of eye rolls, shared crumbs, and low-stakes ferret mischief. One chronicle from a Spanish convent notes that Sister Judith did share her radish with the long one again. May God temper her leniency. Temper it, he did not. Judith and the long one presumed to be her pet ferret. Belen became a fixture of the mealtime scene. Belen often curled around her owner's feet, like a woolen stole with whiskers. Ferrets were rarely banned from the refectory, possibly because enforcing such a rule would have been a fool's errand. They knew the schedule, they knew the bell, and they definitely knew which sisters were soft touches when it came to sharing scraps. One particularly enterprising ferret in a Swiss convent allegedly learned to distinguish between bread for the table and communion wafers, stealing only the former, thank heavens. Historians still argue whether this was proof of incredible training, divine instinct, or just very picky taste. Not everyone was charmed. Some stricter abbesses insisted that ferrets be kept away from meal service In these houses, novice nuns would attempt elaborate sneak-ins, a ferret hidden inside a satchel or passed under the table from lap to lap like a furry, fidgety rosary. Punishment, when discovered, was typically mild. Chores, fasting. Once writing out the rule of Saint Benedict in full by hand. The ferret, for its part, faced no consequences. One sister allegedly muttered, "If only sin were as charming as him," while watching a ferret chew through a stolen crust. The dining hall, despite its solemn reputation, became a stage for quiet, harmless rebellion. After all, feeding a ferret a slice of boiled beet during Lent wasn't exactly heresy. And in a world of strict fasts, tight routines, and enforced silence, even small gestures like slipping a treat to a whiskered companion felt like reclaiming a piece of your own will. And they weren't just beggars. Ferrets became fixtures at specific spots along the table. Some sat loyally beneath their nun of choice. Others moved tactically like tiny generals from bench to bench in search of weak defenses and dropped morsels. Some even timed their appearances to specific courses. Porridge brought the boldest out. Stewed onions, less enthusiasm. Steamed fish, full-scale ferret invasion. A nun from an Italian convent wrote of 3 creatures trained or born to the bell who emerged exactly at the midpoint of every meal and made their circuit with the confidence of cardinals. She claimed they could smell cabbage through stone. That's probably true. You can smell it now. There's even one known case of a ferret receiving a tiny dish of its own. According to the marginal notes of a convent inventory, a ceramic bowl was placed on the floor for the blessed thief. The same record shows a drawing of a little paw reaching into a pot with the Latin caption, "Non tecum sed prop te," not with you, but near you. And that about sums it up. The ferrets weren't officially part of the dining ritual, but they hovered at its edges like saints too mischievous for canonization. You glance around now and see them still, one curled under a bench, twitching in sleep. Another weaving between feet like an unusually opinionated shadow. You catch a sister's eye across the table she pretends not to notice, as her ferret gnaws at a bean on her plate. You smile, then spoon another mouthful of something vaguely beige and nutritious into your mouth. Here at the communal table, humans and animals share a wordless pact. I won't tell if you won't. And besides, in a world where so much was forbidden, a little warmth and a stolen carrot never hurt anyone. You're lying flat on your back in the dormitory, eyes tracing the heavy beams above. Outside, the wind combs through the trees with its usual nocturnal restlessness. Inside, the only sounds are the sighs and slow breathing of sisters, trying and mostly failing to fall asleep. Except for you. And a ferret currently curled up on your pillow, snoring. Nighttime in the convent was not, as you might expect, a realm of serenity. It was creaky floorboards, cold toes, and a mental tug-of-war between holy reflection and how much longer until I'm allowed to move. But for all its discomforts, night was also when the quietest bonds with the ferrets formed. Most convents had shared sleeping quarters, dormitories lined with modest cots, blankets thin as pennants, and windows cracked open to let in the righteous chill. The rule books often insisted on silence, modesty, and strict posture, even in sleep. But rules couldn't account for the warmth of a small, wiggly creature curling into your side. One documented case in a 14th century English convent mentions a ferret named Edeva, who made her vigil in the folds of Sister Amisha's robe. The entry doesn't mention how long the abbess tried to stop it, but does note that Amisha's bed had a bit of straw laid out for the weasel. That straw was later replaced with linen scraps, a quiet, unspoken permission. Historians still argue whether such nighttime co-sleeping arrangements were officially sanctioned, discouraged, but tolerated, or merely overlooked. but the sheer number of marginal drawings of sleeping nuns curled around fluffy creatures suggests it was more common than not. One French psalter shows a nun eyes closed in bliss with a ferret snoozing on her chest like a fuzzy loaf. The artist even gave the ferret a tiny sleeping cap. And it wasn't just about cuteness. Ferrets were warm, in buildings where winter slipped in through every crack and the fire's warmth died long before dawn. A ferret's little furnace of a body could mean the difference between comfort and shivering through matins. That fact alone might explain why so many nuns accidentally left their cloaks open at night, just wide enough to let a curious snout find its way in. But as with all things conventual, nighttime ferret life had its scandals. One novice was apparently bitten on the nose during a dream involving custard. Another was disciplined, not for harboring a ferret in bed, but for smuggling in extra turnip slices to encourage him to stay. "Do not bribe the creatures of God," the abbess wrote likely through barely concealed laughter. Some convents tried to create designated animal-free zones in the dormitory. These attempts usually lasted until the first frost. After that, priorities shifted from order to warmth. Ferrets, always opportunists, adjusted accordingly. There are entire sets of bedtime prayers where lines have been scratched out and replaced in smaller, messier handwriting. One such version reads, "And if I am called in my sleep, may I wake with peace, and not with a ferret in my shoe." Shoes, incidentally, were a favorite hiding place, especially the soft, fleece-lined indoor slippers worn in colder months. A ferret seeking shelter might slink into a shoe and promptly fall asleep, which led to more than a few startled yelps and one recorded case of a broken sandal strap in a frantic morning escape attempt. Then there were the dreams. It's said, though you're pretty sure this isn't canonical, that dreams dreamt with a ferret nearby are stranger, warmer, and somehow more vivid. A nun in Saxony once swore she dreamt of St. Francis handing her a daisy, only to wake and find a half-eaten flower petal in her blanket. Coincidence, possibly. But also, maybe not. You watch now as your current bedmate twitches in her sleep, little feet jerking like she's chasing something. Maybe she is. Maybe in her dreams, she's running through meadows of rosemary or stealing bread from heaven's own table. You'll never know. You just watch and breathe. And there's something comforting about it. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her tiny chest, perfectly in time with yours. The way she's chosen you for no reason other than warmth and proximity. No judgment, no sermons, just fur breath and sleep. You're not alone in the room, of course. Somewhere to your left, another sister chuckles quietly. You hear a whispered scolding. No Benedict, not the blanket again. 2 ferrets apparently tonight. Maybe more. The dormitory is more zoo than Zendo. Still, when the next bell tolls the midnight vigil, you know most of them will disappear. Back to their hiding spots, their little nests in cloaks or under floorboards. But a few will linger, blinking sleepily in the candlelight as the sisters rise for prayer. They never join, of course, but they watch. And maybe that's enough. You're outside again early morning this time, the sky still blushing faintly with the last of night. Dew clings to the grass like forgotten beads on a veil. Your breath puffs in little clouds as you shuffle past the garden wall, past the dovecote, and toward the one place every nun visited more than any chapel cell or cloister. The laundry yard. In theory, it's just a corner of the convent with a few weathered tubs, some flat stones for scrubbing a line of hemp rope stretched between 2 stubborn poles, and a permanently damp smell. In practice, it's where everything happens: gossip, penance, punishment, invention, and as you might expect, ferrets. Yes, even here the long-tailed ambassadors of chaos found a niche. Laundry was a near-daily task in medieval convents, especially when your only other outfit was still dripping from yesterday's rinse. And ferrets naturally found it fascinating. The swishing water, the flicking soap, suds the possibility of hidden treats or lost socks. The laundry yard became a kind of spa resort for them. A messy, sudsy, unwelcome one, but a resort nonetheless. One nun described it in a letter to her cousin as a place of penance, interrupted by fuzz and folly. While most animals wisely avoided the cold splash of wash basins, ferrets would climb along the laundry lines, dart through baskets, and even nap inside folded wimples if you left them unattended. A Scottish convent ledger documents 3 veils being ruined by chewing of hem by pet of Sister C. There's no follow-up, but you can imagine the look Sister C gave her ferret when she discovered it. Historians still argue whether convents ever assigned formal roles to their ferrets during these tasks. Some say yes, that in certain Flemish abbeys, ferrets were actually trained to help chase pests from drying linens. Others dismiss this as romanticized lore, pointing out that a ferret is far more likely to tangle in a chemise than guard it. But there is evidence, albeit charmingly circumstantial. Sketches in one laundry manual from Avignon show a nun holding a washing paddle in one hand and gently guiding a ferret away from the soap pot with the other. The ferret is drawn with exaggerated eyebrows, as if to suggest guilt or cunning. And it wasn't just accidents. Ferrets sometimes ran off with small laundry items, cuffs, belts, even the occasional hair ribbon. In one well-circulated tale, a novice spent 3 weeks unable to find her scapular tie, only to discover it woven into a ferret nest behind the compost bin. She wore it again anyway. Holiness, it seems, covers a multitude of nibble marks. But as with the sellers, these animal companions provided more than trouble. They made the long, bone-chilling hours of laundry feel just a little more bearable. You could scrub for hours, fingers raw and sleeves soaked, but the moment a ferret popped its head out of a laundry basket and blinked at you, the world softened. Some sisters even sang to them. Not hymns, ferrets didn't seem to appreciate polyphony, but little ditties and lullabies. A traveling bishop once remarked in his diary that the sisters did croon beneath the washing tree, accompanied by the strangest of weasel choirs. You'd pay money to hear that recording. And though abbesses frowned on any behavior that disrupted the discipline of the yard, it was hard to discipline joy. A ferret climbing up your sleeve as you beat a tunic against a flat rock didn't exactly scream heresy. Still, things sometimes went sideways. One abbey had to suspend laundry duties for 2 days after a particularly energetic ferret named Joris leapt into the dye vat and emerged a disturbingly vibrant shade of blue. Blue ferret, blue linens, blue sisters, and an entire afternoon of controlled hysterics behind closed doors. There were attempts to keep them out, of course. Barriers, boxes. One convent even tried to bless the laundry yard with extra incense to dissuade visits. Didn't work. If anything, the ferrets just seemed more relaxed afterward. At some point, you give in. You leave out a little dry corner of cloth near the fire, just big enough for a ferret to nap on. You might even tie your apron tighter to stop curious noses from exploring your waistband. You live with it. You laugh at it. Because really, laundry in a medieval convent wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about humility, repetition, endurance. And if you're going to spend your earthly hours rinsing vinegar from wool, you might as well have company. Especially if that company looks up at you with a twitchy nose and a face that says, "I knocked over your soap and I'm not sorry." You toss another tunic over the line, shake out your sleeves, and watch a small streak of fur vanish into the basket of freshly folded coifs. Of course, there goes another one. The chapel smells of beeswax and thyme. Morning light filters in through a rose window that casts sleepy colors across the flagstones. You kneel, whispering a psalm under your breath, words familiar enough to recite even with your thoughts elsewhere. Like, say, the faint scratch, scratch coming from under the altar step. Because yes, even here in the holiest, most sacred heart of the convent, ferrets found their way in. Now let's be clear. Officially, the chapel was meant to be animal-free. This wasn't a garden or laundry yard. This was where you stood before God, where you recited the hour's eyes heavy from too little sleep and too much starch, where incense filled your nose until you forgot what air tasted like, where even clearing your throat too loudly earned a warning glance. But try telling a ferret that. They crept in during Vespers, slinked along the shadowed edges of the choir stalls, and sometimes napped behind the base of the crucifix. Not disrespectfully, just practically. It was warm, quiet, peaceful. Honestly, who wouldn't want to sleep through logs tucked into a velvet altar cloth? Historians still argue whether these chapel incursions were the result of nuns sneaking in their companions or ferrets simply being too clever for the doors and thresholds. Either way, they became an unspoken fixture. One sister might pass another a missal, and beneath it, a curled-up fuzzball dozing in the folds of her scapular. Another might pause mid-prayer to gently extract a tail from under her sandal. Marginalia in a 15th century Italian breviary shows a nun trying to read while a ferret steals the bookmark. The caption simply says, "Domine libera me, Lord, deliver me." You imagine God didn't mind the interruption. Of course, not everyone found the situation charming. Some abbesses demanded purges, stationing novices at the chapel doors to shoo away animals before prayers began. The novices, unfortunately, had the backbone of a cooked leek. It's difficult to maintain discipline when the creature you're trying to expel looks up at you like. But I always sit next to Sister Marguerite during Compline. One well-circulated story tells of a visiting bishop who gave a sermon while an entirely indifferent ferret climbed the organ pipes behind him. The bishop, to his credit, finished the homily. But the real applause went to the ferret, who managed to nap inside the pedal box without being crushed. Divine intervention, maybe. And sometimes the presence of these creatures had almost mystical resonance. There's a tale from a convent near Ghent of a ferret who emerged during every funeral, always resting briefly at the foot of the coffin before vanishing. Some sisters believed it was an omen. Others said he was just following the smell of lilies. Either way, he became known as Little Saint Benedict, and no one dared remove him. He eventually died in the chapel and was buried under the garden yew tree. They placed a stone over the spot. It still reads in Latin, "He was small. He was swift. He stayed." You look around the chapel, now eyes soft from the candlelight, and you begin to understand. Life in a convent was layered with silences, not just the imposed ones, but emotional ones. Sisters who longed for homes they'd left or for futures they never had. Sisters who bore losses without ever naming them out loud. In those long, echoing stretches of prayer, a ferret's sudden sneeze or the tickle of fur brushing past your ankle could break the stillness just enough to remind you you're still here, still alive, still a creature just like them. One nun wrote in her journal, "When I speak to God, I ask for patience. But when she sleeps beside me in the pew, I feel I've already been heard." Eventually, some convents even began embracing the presence of these creatures during worship. Quietly, gently. One chapel commissioned a small carving of Saint Melangelle, not just with her traditional rabbit companions, but with a weasel curled around her wrist. Another installed a tiny shelf near the organ loft, with a woven basket simply labeled guests. That's what they were, really. Not pets, not mascots. Guests. Welcome strange, unpredictable guests who somehow taught the sisters more about attentiveness and compassion than many sermons ever could. And so you kneel still now as the last prayer fades. The ferret beneath your bench shifts sighs and drifts back to sleep. You envy her a little. The garden has shifted again. Late afternoon light spills over the hedges like honey, and the convent feels just for this moment less like a fortress of discipline and more like a place exhaled into being by some gentler god. You're kneeling by the herb beds now, fingers working time between your nails when you feel it, a rustle in the underbrush, the telltale sound of something long and low-bodied, causing botanical mischief. You don't even look. You just sigh and say, "Not the marjoram again, please." A pause, then a tiny chitter. Of course, exactly the marjoram. Ferrets in the garden, predictable chaos, and somehow also peace. See, gardens in medieval convents weren't just plots of practical dirt. They were sacred spaces, equal parts pharmacy, kitchen supply, and spiritual metaphor. They had to be functional cabbages, leeks, garlic, medicinal calendula, a surprising amount of horehound, but they also carried quiet symbolism. The Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed garden, was a recurring image in devotional texts, a metaphor for the Virgin Mary, for purity, for sanctuary. And here you were flicking ferret droppings off the strawberry patch. Poetic. Historians still argue whether these gardens doubled as animal enclosures or if the ferrets simply annexed them. But many suggest that the sisters began designing their beds with ferret activity in mind. Raised borders discouraged digging. Small stone paths gave them places to run without flattening sage. And of course, hollowed-out gourd houses tucked under the hedges gave them places to nap. There's a record from a Spanish abbey where one nun trained her ferret to carry parsley sprigs in his teeth back to the kitchen. The record doesn't mention how many sprigs were chewed first, but the intention counts for something. Ferrets loved the garden. The smells, the bugs, the cool shadows under the lavender, and the nuns, weary from hours of reading or fasting or kneeling, loved watching them. Because in a place ruled by silence and order, a ferret tumbling through a mint bush was a reminder that not everything had to follow the plan. Some even came to believe these creatures were spiritually instructive. They remind us, wrote one abbess, that devotion is not the same as stillness. You watch one now, tail twitching like a metronome as she tries to climb a trellis. She fails, of course, but looks outrageously pleased with herself anyway. You think maybe that's what holiness looks like. One garden diary kept meticulously by a sister in Burgundy devotes 2 entire pages to listing which plants her ferret liked to sleep under. First dill, then violets, then curiously fennel, though only in dry weather. The diary concludes God made all creatures. This one, I think, was made for naps and disorder. But not everything was quaint. Ferrets occasionally stole from the apothecary plots, snatching up medicinal roots or chewing the bark off drying sticks of willow. One nun mistook a ferret hole for the beginning of divine sinkage and insisted on emergency reconsecration of the west garden wall. The ferret was later found asleep in the compost. No divine messages were received, though the abbess did consider it a teachable moment. And even here, death was part of the rhythm. Ferrets did not live long, 6-7 years at best. And in convents where time moved slowly, that span passed quickly. When they passed, the sisters mourned them quietly, sometimes with prayers, sometimes with simple burial ceremonies near the wall or beneath the elder tree. One convent kept a tiny book of names listing every ferret who'd ever lived among them. Some names were saintly Agatha Francis, Others were suspiciously silly Puddle-Father Crispin Chomp. No one really knew who started that tradition. Everyone kept it going. Today you find a new name being quietly added, Mina. A small hand, neat script. No embellishment. Just remembrance. You placed your hands in your lap, brushing off rosemary and soil. The bells will ring soon. Vespers again. Another chapter in the endless cycle of chant and silence, work and prayer, sleep and wake. And through it all, still ferrets. Faithful, ridiculous, soft-edged companions who made sacred space feel lived in. It's strange, isn't it? You came to the convent thinking you were giving things up, freedom, luxury, noise. And yet you gained this absurd, beautiful companionship. These creatures who never pretended to be pious, who didn't kneel or chant, but who showed you day after day what comfort looked like, what mischief looked like, what love looked like in a small, warm body with a tail and no respect for holy relics. You rise, wipe your hands. Behind you, a rustle, a sneeze, then the unmistakable sound of tiny claws padding over packed earth. She's following you. Of course she is. The garden gate swings shut behind you, and you step into the long shadow of the cloister. And now, here you are once again in the quiet. The convent has gone still. The last candles have guttered down, and only the soft breathing of your sisters surrounds you, rising and falling like a tide. You lie back on your straw-filled mattress, the faint smell of lavender clinging to your pillow, your hands folded in the habit of sleep. Outside, somewhere beyond the stone walls, an owl calls, once then falls silent. The air has cooled. The night holds steady. Beside you, a warm shape curls against your ribs. She sighs in her sleep, that tiny exhale of peace, and you can feel the delicate weight of her body rising and falling. You don't move. You don't even blink. You just stay there still and calm, letting the moment stretch out like thread through a loom. The day is done. The prayers have been said. The garden rests, the chapel breathes, the laundry yard lies empty. All that's left is this hush, this shared quiet between human and creature. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for anything. The kind that simply is. Let your breath match hers now. In, out, soft, gentle, easy. Let the memories blur. Let the stories drift away like incense smoke curling to the ceiling. Let your limbs grow heavy the way stone sinks into earth. You're safe here. You're warm. You're exactly where you're meant to be. The ferret stirs once more, then stillness and sleep.